The testimony of first-class passenger Mrs. J. Stewart White was taken separately before Senator William Alden Smith, chairman of the Senate Subcommittee, on Thursday, May 2nd, 1912. Do you make the Waldorf Astoria your permanent home, Mrs. White?
My home really is Briarcliff Lodge, Briarcliff Manor, New York. That is my summer home. When I'm in New York, I'm always here at the Waldorf Astoria.
I want to ask you one or two questions, Mrs. White, and let you answer them in your own way. You were a passenger on the Titanic?
Yes.
Where did you get aboard the ship?
At Cherbourg.
Where were your apartments on the Titanic? What deck were you on?
We were on Deck C.
Do you remember the number of the room?
I do not believe I could tell you with any degree of certainty at all. Miss Young and my maid could tell you.
Miss Young or your maid would know the number of the room?
Yes. I never went out of my room from the time I went into it. I was never outside of the door until I came off the night of the collision.
That was due, I believe, to a little accident you had on entering the ship?
Yes, sir.
You went directly to your apartment and remained there?
Yes. I remained in my room until I came out that night. I never took a step from my bed until that night.
Were you aroused especially by the impact?
No, not at all. I was just sitting on the bed, just ready to turn the lights out. It did not seem to me that there was any very great impact at all. It was just as though we went over about 1,000 marbles. There was nothing terrifying about it at all.
Were you aroused by any one of the ship's officers or crew?
No.
Do you know whether there was any alarm turned in for the passengers?
We heard no alarm whatever. We went immediately on deck ourselves.
You went on deck?
Yes, sir.
What were they doing then?
Simply all standing around.
Was there anything being done about the lifeboats?
No. We were all standing around inside, waiting to know what the result was.
The lifeboats had not then been cleared.
Nothing had been said about the lifeboats in any way. When suddenly Captain Smith came down the stairway and ordered us all to put on our life preservers, which we did, we stood around for another 20 minutes then, I should think.
Where did you enter the lifeboat?
I entered the lifeboat from the top deck where the boats were. We had to enter the boat there. There was no other deck to the steamer except the top deck. It was a perfect rat trap. There was no other deck that was open at all.
Do you recollect which boat you entered?
Boat 8, the second off.
On which side of the ship?
I could not tell you. It was the side going this way. The left side as we were going.
That would be the port side?
Yes. I got in the second boat that was lowered.
What officer stood there?
I could not tell you that. I have no idea.
What officer supervised this work?
I have no idea. I could not even tell whether it was an officer or the captain. I know we were told to get into the boat.
Did you have any difficulty in getting into the boat?
None whatever. They handled me very carefully because I could hardly step. They lifted me in very carefully and very nicely.
How far from the side of the ship did the lifeboat hang? Were you able to step into it?
Oh, yes.
Or were you passed into it?
No, we stepped into it. It did not hang far out.
Did you see anything after the accident bearing upon the discipline of the officers or crew, or their conduct which you desired to speak of?
Yes, lots about them.
Tell me about that.
For instance, before we cut loose from the ship, 2 of the seamen with us, the men I should say, I do not call them seamen, I think they were dining room stewards. Before we were cut loose from the ship, they took out cigarettes and lighted them. On an occasion like that. That is one thing that we saw. All of those men escaped under the pretense of being oarsmen. The man who rowed me took his oar and rowed all over the boat in every direction, and I said to him, "Well, why don't you put the oar in the oarlock?" And he said, "Did you put it in that hole?" I said, "Certainly." He said, "I never had an oar in my hand before." I spoke to the other man, and he said, "I have never had an oar in my hand before, but I think I can row." Those were the men that we were put to sea with that night, with all those magnificent fellows left on board who would have been such a protection to us.
How many were there in your boat?
There were 22 women and 4 men.
None of these men seemed to know the management of a boat?
Yes, there was one there, one who was supposed to be a seaman, up at the end of our boat, who gave the orders.
Do you know who he was?
No, I do not know. I do not know the names of any of those men, but he seemed to know something about it.
I wish you would describe, as nearly as you can, just what took place after your lifeboat got away from the Titanic.
We simply rowed away. We had the order on leaving the ship to do that. The officer who put us in the boat, I do not know who he was, gave strict orders to the seamen or the men to make for the light opposite and land the passengers and get back just as soon as possible. That was the light that everyone saw in the distance.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it distinctly.
What was it?
It was a boat of some kind.
How far away was it?
Oh, it was 10 miles away, but we could see it distinctly. There was no doubt that it was a boat. But we rowed and rowed and rowed, and then we all suggested that it was simply impossible for us to get to it, that we never could get to it, and the thing to do was to go back and see what we could do for the others. We only had 22 in our boat. Then we turned and went back and lingered around there for a long time, trying to locate the other boats, but we could not locate them except by hearing them. The only way they could locate us was by my electric light. The lamp on the boat was absolutely worth nothing. I had an electric cane, a cane with an electric light in it, and that was the only light we had. We sat there for a long time, and we saw the ship go down, distinctly.
What was your impression as it went down?
It was something dreadful. Nobody ever thought the ship was going down. I do not think there was a person that night. I don't think there was a man on that boat that thought the ship was going down. They speak of the bravery of the men. I do not think there was any particular bravery, because none of the men thought it was going down. If they had thought the ship was going down, they would not have frivoled as they did about it. Some of them said, "When you come back, you will need a pass. And you cannot get on tomorrow morning without a pass." They never would have said those things if anybody had had any idea that the ship was going to sink. In my opinion, the ship, when it went down, was broken in two. I think very probably it broke in two. I heard 4 distinct explosions, which we supposed were the boilers. Of course, we did not know anything about it.
How loud were those explosions?
They were tremendous. We did what we were ordered to do. We went toward the light. That seemed to be the verdict of everyone in the boat. We had strict orders to do that from the officer or whoever started us off, to row as fast as possible for that boat, land the passengers, and come right back for the others. We all supposed that boat was coming toward us on account of all the rockets that we sent up.
Did you urge the man in charge of your lifeboat to go back?
One of us did.
Did you urge him to go back to seek to pick up more people?
Not until we had gone out for half an hour and found it perfectly useless to attempt to reach that boat or that light. Then everybody suggested going back, and we did too, but we could not get there.
You went back?
Yes. The sailor changed our course and tried to go back. That was after trying to reach that light for 3/4 of an hour. It was evidently impossible to reach it. It seemed to be going in the same direction in which we were going, and we made no headway toward it at all. Then we turned and tried to go back.
Did anybody try to get in or get out of your boat?
No.
Did you land alongside the Carpathia with the same party with which you started from the boat deck of the Titanic?
Exactly.
You all landed safely?
We all landed safely. We had a great deal of trouble, but we all landed safely.
Did you make any attempt to communicate with your friends after you got aboard the Carpathia, by wireless or otherwise?
That was the first thing we did.
Did you succeed?
No, we did not succeed. They never received the telegram until last Monday night in this hotel. They took our telegram the first thing when we got aboard the Carpathia, Monday morning. They took our marconigram. I think the people on land had a much more serious time than we had, so far as real suffering was concerned.
Will you describe what you saw after daybreak with regard to ice or icebergs?
After we got aboard the Carpathia, we could see 13 icebergs and 45 miles of floating ice, distinctly, right around us in every direction. Everybody knew we were in the vicinity of icebergs. Even in our staterooms, it was so cold that we could not leave the porthole open. It was terribly cold. I made the remark to Miss Young on Sunday morning. We must be very near icebergs to have such cold weather as this. It was unusually cold. It was a careless, reckless thing. It seems almost useless to speak of it. No one was frightened on the ship. There was no panic. There was no excitement whatever. There was a lot of pathos when husbands and wives kissed each other goodbye, of course. We were the second boat pushed away from the ship, and we saw nothing that happened after that. We were not near enough. We heard the yells of the steerage passengers as they went down, but we saw none of the harrowing part of it at all. As I said before, the men in our boat were anything but seamen, with the exception of one man. The women all rowed, every one of them. Miss Young rowed every minute. The men could not row. They did not know the first thing about it. Miss Swift from Brooklyn rowed every minute, from the steamer to the Carpathia. Miss Young rowed every minute also, except when she was throwing up, which she did 6 or 7 times. Where would we have been if it had not been for our women, with such men as that put in charge of the boat? Our head seaman would give an order, and those men who knew nothing about the handling of a boat would say, "If you don't stop talking through that hole in your face, there will be one less in the boat." We were in the hands of men of that kind. I settled 2 or 3 fights between them and quieted them down. Imagine getting right out there and taking out a pipe and filling it and standing there smoking, with the women rowing, which was most dangerous. We had woolen rugs all around us. Another thing which I think is a disgraceful point, the men were asked when they got into our boat if they could row. Imagine asking men who are supposed to be at the head of lifeboats. Imagine asking them if they can row. There is another point that has never been brought out in regard to this accident, and that is that the steamer had no open decks except the top deck. How could they fill the lifeboats properly? They could not lower a lifeboat 70 feet with any degree of safety with more than 20 people in it. Where were they going to get any more in them on the way down? There were no other open decks. Just to think that a beautiful starlit night, you could see the stars reflected in the water, with all those warnings, that they would allow such an accident to happen, with such a terrible loss of life and property.
There were no male passengers in your boat.
Not one. I never saw a finer body of men in my life than the passengers of this trip. Athletes and men of sense. And if they had been permitted to enter these lifeboats with their families, the boats would have been appropriately manned and many more lives saved. Instead of allowing the stewards to get in the boats and save their lives under the pretense that they could row, when they knew nothing whatever about it.
I'm very much obliged to you for your statement, Mrs. White.